I learned early on in my career that it's really very difficult for an audience to laugh and sleep at the same time. So, although this is not a comic novel, I'm going to read you the only portion of it which may make you laugh a little bit. So I'm going to introduce one of the three main characters. Her name is Sarah Hovardy Jennings, and she is a member of the Sovereign Citizens Movement. This is a far right-wing anarchist organization in America which believes in absolutely no governmental control. They don't have a contract with the government. They live in America, but of course, they don't pay taxes, and they don't obey any laws. They don't feel that they have to. They feel that the laws are illegal and oppressive. And Sarah kind of gets by under the radar. She earns her living as a farrier. That is, she goes to wealthy people's houses and shoes their horses. This novel takes place in Northern California, near Fort Bragg, in the Redwood Forest of Northern California. As Toof said, the impetus for this was a story in the news about a young shooter, a young man who was schizophrenic. He was drifting farther and farther away from reality, but his kindly uncle gave him a Chinese assault rifle. Part of the challenge for me in this novel was to get into his mind and give you the view of a schizophrenic. In the actual story I'm basing it on, and in the story I've fictionalized, here's what happens. He becomes increasingly delusional and winds up shooting two people. And then, because he fashions himself as a kind of a mountain man or survivalist, he's able to elude the SWAT team, the police, their dogs, their helicopters for 5 weeks, living in the woods. They can't catch him. Meanwhile, back to Sarah. Here will be the introduction of her, but what you won't hear tonight, because they're only limiting us to 8 hours. And if I only read for 8 hours, we're not going to get to this part, okay? She will become very attached to Adam, but that hasn't happened yet. In this chapter, which introduces her, you will get an idea of who she is from her point of view. So, by the way, this is an artifact from the Santa Barbara Historical Museum. We haven't had rain in 4 years. I had to rent it from them because I knew I was coming here. I'm hoping it'll rain really hard tomorrow because I'm going to get a bucket of water and bring it back to Santa Barbara with me. All right, so here is Sarah, introduction to Sarah from The Harder They Come. She didn't like fast food, or not particularly. The grease they used hardened your arteries, and they doused everything with corn syrup and sugar, which jacked up the calories and made you put on weight. An issue with her, she knew it. But she stopped at the place on Route 20 in Willits and got a crispy chicken sandwich, if only to put something on her stomach. It wasn't like her to oversleep, but that's what had happened. And she'd had to skip breakfast and run out the door with nothing but a cup of yesterday's coffee microwaved to an angry boil, and she still wound up being half an hour late for her morning appointment. As a concession to the little voice nagging in her head, she skipped the fries and ordered a diet drink instead of regular, though she did ask for crispy instead of grilled, because grilled had no more taste than warmed over cardboard with a spatter of ketchup on it. Her dog, Kucha, was in the back seat, generally behaving himself, but he came to attention when she pulled into the drive-through lane. He must have recognized the place, if not by sight, then smell, though she hadn't stopped here more than a handful of times. At any rate, he began whining and tap-dancing around on the seat he'd rendered filthy despite the towel she'd spread over it, and she gave in and ordered him a burger. No bun, no condiments, no pickles. Feeding it to him over her shoulder as she put the trusty blue Nissan Sentra in drive and sailed on out of the lot and down the long, winding road to Fort Bragg and the coast. There was talk on the radio, but it was mainly left-wing communist crap, NPR, and how come their signal was stronger than anybody else's? And even that faded out once she started down the grade and hit the first few switchbacks. So she popped in a CD instead. She favored country, but the old stuff, the classic stuff, Loretta and Merle and Hank, because all the new singers with their custom-made boots and blow-dried hair were just pale imitators anyway. And if people criticized her for being a once-divorced 40-year-old woman with no romantic prospects on the horizon who really wasn't in step with the times, you mean not even Brad Paisley? So much the worse. She liked what she liked. And when she went out on a Saturday night with her best friend, Christabel Walsh, and had a few beers, she just let the music wash right over her, like the vapid stares of all the losers lined up at the bar who were too small-minded and self-absorbed to ask a woman to dance. No matter. She dwelled within herself. She was content and self-sufficient. She had her own business. She had Kucha, a rented two-bedroom clapboard house that looked down on the crotch of the Noyo Valley and half the horses in the world available to her anytime she wanted to ride. If another relationship came along, fine. If not, too bad for him or them or whoever they might be. But she wasn't desperate, not in the least, not even close. And there was no way in the world she was going to pretend to like Brad Paisley or whoever, because to her, it was all just more of the same sing-song, bastardized crap. And she'd told Christabel that, and she'd tell anybody else who might want to stick their nose in, too. So there she was, driving in her own personal property with her dog by her side and a living to earn, winding down Route 20 so she could get to the Coast Highway and head 44.5 miles south to the little fly-speck town of Calpurnia, where there were 3 horses, and if the veterinarian showed up on time, at least 1 sable antelope with 3-foot horns that needed her ministrations. It was the middle of the summer. The sky was clear, the sun fixed like a compass point ahead of her. When she looped round a turn and saw the coast off in the distance, it was clear there, too. The fog burned back and exiled in a linty gray band out at sea. Was she wearing her seatbelt? No, she wasn't. And she was never going to wear it either. Seatbelt laws were just another contrivance of the U.S. illegitimate government of America, the corporate that had given up the gold standard back in 1933 and pledged its citizens as collateral so it could borrow and keep on borrowing. But she wasn't a citizen of the USIGA. She was a sovereign citizen, a U.S. national, born and raised. And she didn't now and never would again acknowledge anybody's illegitimate authority over her. So no, she wasn't wearing her seatbelt. And she didn't have legal plates, or the sort of plates the Republic of California deemed legal, that is. The sticker that had come with the ones on the car was long since expired because she wasn't about to play that game. And if she was traveling on the public roads in her own personal property, it was her business and nobody else's. When the cop pulled her over, he claimed it was because she wasn't wearing a seatbelt. But of course, he would have had to have raptor's eyes to see that from 300 feet away, where he was fooling nobody behind a roadside clump of madrone, except maybe the drifting black vultures overhead. She'd watched him swing out behind her, pulling a U-turn and settling in on her tail with his gumball machine spinning and his siren whoop, whoop, whooping. She might have gone half a mile or more before she finally pulled over. In a spot at the mouth of a dirt drive that seemed sufficiently safe, the whole road to this point bristling with jagged pines and dried-up weeds that snatched at the side of the car every time she drifted toward the shoulder. Looking back on it, she supposed she could have stopped sooner. And she supposed, too, that this might have had something to do with this particular cop's agitation. But you did what you did, and you couldn't have regrets, not in this life that just marched you on toward the grave day by day. He was lean, young, fresh-faced. He had to tap at the window 3 times before she rolled it down. Kucha lurched forward to give him a low warning growl, and then he was barking, and she didn't do a thing about it. Let him bark. That was what she felt. It was his right. "Do you know why I stopped you, ma'am?" the cop said. Of course she did. He was the oppressor, and she was the oppressed. She said nothing. "License and registration," the cop said, raising his voice to be heard over the clamor of the dog, "and proof of insurance." What she told him in response, in a voice as steady as she could hold it, even as Kucha settled into a ragged, gasping, continuous, low-throated bark, and people slowed to gape at her as if she were some circus attraction, was that she was not engaged in a contract with the Republic of California. "I am a sovereign citizen," she said, speaking as clearly as she could given the noise of the dog and the clank and hiss of the traffic as all the white-haired baby boomer tourists applied their brakes and then stepped back on the gas once they'd got a good look. You have no authority over me." The cop just stared at her. After a moment, he flipped up his sunglasses so she could see the fine red fissures of irritation fracturing his frog-belly eyes. "Maybe you didn't hear me," he said, "but I asked for your license and registration." She said nothing, just fixed her gaze straight ahead to where the road ran on into the sunshine, past a field of stiff yellow grass and a shadowy fringe of trees, the road that ran true to her destination, to the place where she had business when she had no business here at all. "Ma'am?" She turned her head back to him, locked her eyes on his, and her heart was going now, all right, because she could tell where this was heading, and it scared her, and it made the anger come up in her. And why couldn't they just leave well enough alone? "I told you," she said, "I have no contract with you." "Does that mean you refuse?" "Let me repeat, I have no contract with you." He shifted his boots in the gravel along the roadside, a dull, grating, intolerable sound that got Kucha back up into the high register. The cop put his hands on his hips as if to show her where the gun was, and the nightstick and handcuffs, too. He said, "I'm going to have to ask you to step out of the car." "No," she said, "I won't." "Suit yourself." He straightened up then and stalked back to his car, where she could see him in her rear view as he leaned in, pulled out the cord of the radio mic, and started moving his lips. 10 long minutes crept by. Each one of them, each second, dripped acid through her veins, and she thought of just putting the car in gear and driving off, but resisted because that would only make things worse. Kucha, he was a pulley, a white pulley, settled into the discolored basket of his dreadlocks and fell off to sleep, thinking the threat had passed, foolishly. But then he was a dog, and dogs had other concerns. Finally, another cruiser appeared, lights flashing, sirens screaming, swooping on up the road behind her like a black steel shroud, and nosing in at an angle so close to her front bumper she thought it was going to hit her. In the next instant, she was staring across the passenger seat of this new car and into the face, the hard, demanding, unforgiving, put-upon face of a female officer who picked something up off the seat, squared herself, and swung out of the car. Next thing she knew, both cops were there, one on either side of her, and Kucha was back on his feet, back at it again, barking in a renewed frenzy that just made everything that much harder. "Good afternoon," the female cop said, her eyes roaming over the interior as if she was thinking of making an offer on the car. "I understand that you refuse to comply with Officer Switzer's request for identification. Is that right?" She said nothing. The female officer, she was tall, thin, no shape to her at all, and she wore no makeup, not a trace, not even lipstick, asked her to get out of the car, or no, commanded her. Sarah said nothing. "Just to be sure you understand me," the male cop cut in now. He was stationed by the passenger's side window, leaning in so he could watch her. And if that didn't make her feel paranoid, she couldn't imagine what would, because this was like being squeezed between two pincers, and it was wrong, intolerable, a violation of every natural law there was. "I have to inform you that state law requires you to show a valid driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance at the reasonable request of a peace officer." She threw it right back at him. "Reasonable? You call this reasonable? You have no authority here. You're nothing more to me than a man dressed up in a Halloween costume." "If you refuse," he said, the muscles tightening around his mouth, "we will have no recourse but to remove you forcibly from your vehicle." "Which will be impounded," the female added, as if they'd switched speakers on a stereo, his voice assaulting her on the right, hers on the left. "And your dog will be taken to the shelter." She paused. A top-heavy camper swished delicately past them, 10 miles under the limit. A pickup going the opposite way swung with elaborate courtesy off onto the shoulder to give it room, and then continued on in a slow-motion crawl. "And you yourself, if you don't comply this minute, will be arrested. I promise you that. And I personally will escort you to the county jail." It was hopeless. She could see that. The day was ruined. The week, the whole month. This was the megastate in all its glory. She'd stated her status in plain English, and still they didn't seem to understand. Well, they could go to hell, all of them. She started screaming then, calling them every name in the book, shouting, "TDC, TDC, threat, duress, and coercion," over and over again. even as the female forced open the door and took hold of her by her left arm. And Kucha, good dog, faithful dog, went right at her. They took her to the county jail in Ukiah, retracing her route back up Route 20, though now she was in restraints and in the back seat of a police cruiser, separated by a heavy wire grid and plexiglass shield from the female cop, whose right hand, resting at 1 o'clock on the wheel, sported 2 bright, shining, flesh-colored Band-Aids where the dog's teeth had broken the skin, though it wasn't much more than a scratch. Her own car was back alongside the road, awaiting the tow truck. And Kucha, poor Kucha, after having been poked, prodded, and muzzled by 2 numbnuts from animal control, had been forced into a boxy white van, which must have been somewhere behind her now, on its way up this same road to the animal shelter, also in Ukiah. She'd missed her appointment, of course. And for what? For nothing. For a seatbelt? And she'd had no way of letting the Burnsides know she wasn't coming. That she'd been unavoidably and illegally detained and wasn't just blowing off her responsibility. And who could blame them if they went online and found another farrier to shoe their horses and trim the hooves of their sable antelope? She had a reputation to maintain, a business to run, and she was doing no harm to anybody, doing nothing more than using the public byways, as was her inalienable right. And now look at the mess she was in. Still, as the cruiser looped through the turns and climbed back up out of the Noyo Valley, she began to rethink her position until, degree by degree, she felt the indignation cooling in her. This was going to cost her. Fines, towing, and Christ knew what else. They'd make her renew that sticker, and there'd be paperwork, a layout of cash she really didn't have, and every sort of hassle the authorities, what a joke, could devise. By the time they arrived at the police station and she'd been photographed and fingerprinted, they'd given her 1 phone call to Christabel, who else, and escorted her to an empty cell and locked her in, she was contrite. Or no, chastened was a better word. And enlightened. Enlightened, too. These people didn't recognize her status, didn't know a damn thing about the Uniform Commercial Code or her rights under it, and they didn't care either. They had all the power, all the muscle, and she was nothing. Reduced to this, to groveling and ass-kissing and giving lip service to the system as if she was grateful they'd assaulted her and taken away her rights and her property? All right. If that was how they wanted it, fine. She sat in that cell and kept her mouth firmly shut and fed her hate and resentment till Christabel showed up an hour later with the bail money, and she was out. I told you, Christabel said once they'd slammed into her pickup in the lot out back of the station. You may have your theories or beliefs or whatever, but these people, they don't care. They're on another planet. This planet, planet Earth. She gave her a look, all eyeshadow and glistening black mascara. And you're in outer space. I mean it, Sarah. I really do. Christabel was 2 years older than she was, also divorced, also childless. She'd kept her figure and had men sniffing after her 7 days a week, but she was done with men, or that's what she said anyway, at least till the next one came along. She was Sarah's best friend, and here she was proving it all over again, taking time out from her work as a teacher's aide at the elementary school to be there for her. But she was wrong on this, dead wrong. It's not theory, Sarah said. It's law, natural law. There you go. I mean, don't you ever learn? They were heading out of the parking lot now, the police lot, and the idiot dinger started in because she wasn't wearing her seatbelt. And buckle your belt, will you? Contrite? Who was contrite? No, she said, no way. That was when Christabel hit the brakes so hard she nearly went through the window. I swear I'm not going another inch until you buckle up. And not just because of what happened here, and not for safety's sake either, but because I can't stand that fucking noise 1 more second. You don't have to shout. I mean, there's nothing wrong with my hearing. Still, she didn't touch the belt. It was as if her hands were paralyzed. The noise kept up. Ding, 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 a beat. Then ding, 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 and ding, ding, ding. Sarah, I'm warning you. I mean it. I do. She let her gaze roll on out over the scene. She was calm now, utterly calm. Traffic flicked by on the street. Ding, 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 ding. A girl who honestly couldn't have been more than 16 went by pushing one of those double baby strollers, as if there was nothing wrong with that, as if this was the way people were supposed to live. She looked over her shoulder and saw that there was a car in the lot behind them, a face trapped in the blaze of the windshield, some other soul trying to get out of this purgatory and back to real life. But nobody was going anywhere unless something changed right here and now. Christabel was glaring at her, actually glaring. In the next moment, and she hardly knew what she was doing, She flipped the handle and pushed the door open wide, and then she was out on the sidewalk, her feet moving and the door gaping behind her, hurrying down the street as fast as her boots would take her, thinking, the bank, gotta get to the bank before it closes. And Christabel? Christabel was just an afterthought because she wasn't going to sit there arguing. She had to get to the bank because she knew she was going to have to suck everything out of her savings and put it into a cashier's check if she was going to get the car out of hock. That was the first priority, the car, because without it, she was stuck. Once she had it back, the minute they handed her the keys, she'd head straight to the animal shelter. Because when she thought about how scared and hurt and confused that dog must have been, it just made her heart seize. He'd never been separated from her since she got him as a pup. Never, not for a single day. And what had he done? Just defend her, that was all. And now he was locked up in a concrete pen with a bunch of strays and pit bulls and God knew what else. She didn't care what anybody said. And they could go ahead and crucify her. But that was as wrong got. Thank you.